Good morning, and welcome to today's webcast event, Peacebuilding in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Revisiting the Toolkit. My name is Hannah Quibo, and I'm a Program Associate with the Wilson Center Africa Program. The Wilson Center was chartered by Congress in 1968 as an official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. The center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. We are proud to say that the University of Pennsylvania's Global Go-To Think Tank Index report recently ranked the Wilson Center as one of the top 10 think tanks globally, and the center holds the #1 spot for both regional studies and institutional collaboration. The Wilson Center Africa program works to address the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations, build mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa relations, and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. Today's event is held under the banner of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, an initiative established with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, or SVNP, is a continent-wide network of African policy, research, and academic organizations that works with the Wilson Center to bring African knowledge and perspectives to U.S., African, and international policy and peacebuilding in Africa. One of the main features of the network is the Research Scholarship Program. Scholars from member organizations are hosted by the Africa Program here in Washington, D.C. for a 3-month resident scholar program where they complete a policy-oriented research project and engage with U.S. policymakers and practitioners. The scholars share their research findings with these policymakers and practitioners while simultaneously bringing their local context and knowledge into U.S. policy discussions. Today, our SVNP scholar, Father Rigobert Manani, will share the results of his research. We're also live tweeting today's event and taking questions on Twitter and via email. So I hope you'll join the discussion. And to do so, please tweet your questions and tag @AfricaUpClose and use the hashtag #PeaceInDRC, or you can email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. We'll also be holding one more SVNP Scholar event next week on June 8th on the topic of countering transnational organized crime as a strategy for peacebuilding in East Africa with Mr. Mesai Gobena from the Institute for Peace and Security Studies in Ethiopia. You can see the Africa Program website for more details on that event. I'd now like to introduce today's moderator, Mr. Michael Morrow. Mike is a senior diplomatic fellow with the Wilson Center. He's a detailee from the U.S. Department of State, where he's a senior foreign service officer. So now I'll turn it over to Mike to provide some context for the topic and introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Hannah, and good morning to our speakers and to everyone following online. Thank you all for joining us today. The topic of our event today, Peacebuilding in the DRC, is crucial for evaluating regional and international engagement with a country that has seen more than 2 decades of conflict. Going back to the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the DRC has endured a series of armed interventions and civil conflicts that have killed or displaced millions of people. Despite the formal end of the Second Congo War in 2003 and several subsequent elections, violence between the government and various rebel groups and factions in the east of the country has never really ended. To help secure the peace in the DRC, the United Nations has deployed a major peacekeeping operation in the form of MONUSCO, also known as the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Initially established as MONUC in 1999, the mission has evolved to become the UN's largest peacekeeping operation worldwide with over 18,000 deployed personnel. However, despite this large force and a $1 billion annual budget, MONUSCO has not been able to establish or keep peace in the Eastern DRC. It has also struggled to protect civilians from violence, which has led to a worsening perception of the mission among the population of the DRC. After about 20 years of operations now, there are increasing calls from the DRC, the UN, and others to reconsider the role of MONUSCO, including possibly reducing or drawing down the mission. Here today, we will broaden the conversation around peace building in the DRC analyzing not just the challenges faced by MONUSCO, but also assessing the larger multifaceted peacebuilding efforts in the DRC. Our terrific lineup of speakers will assess the successes and failures of these efforts and offer recommendations and insights for how the UN, international partners, and other stakeholders and peacebuilders can update their toolkits to better meet the context and needs of the DRC. I'd like now to let our speakers share their thoughts. We have with us today 4 speakers, Ms. Alexis Arieff, Dr. Lisa Genet, Father Rigobert Minani, and Ms. Aditi Gorur. Each of these speakers has been asked to speak to a specific aspect of the topic from their unique perspective. Each speaker will start by offering opening remarks of 8 minutes, and when we get through the 4 speakers, we'll follow it with a question and answer session, with questions sent in from our online audience. As a reminder, you can tweet us any questions to @AfricaUpClose using the hashtag #PeaceInDRC, or you can email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. So what I'll do now is I'll introduce each speaker with a brief bio before they speak. And as a reminder to the speakers and the audience, we will hold strictly to the 8-minute limit. And what I'll do is I'll give a polite verbal cue when there's about a minute remaining so that you can sort of wrap up your thoughts. So our first speaker is Ms. Alexis Arieff. Ms. Arieff is a specialist in African affairs with the Congressional Research Service, where she provides analysis of policy issues regarding North, West, and Central Africa for members of Congress and their staff. She has over 10 years of experience with CRS, including details where she's been detailed to the US mission to the UN and to the Department of Defense. Ms. Arieff holds a bachelor's degree in linguistic anthropology from Brown University and a master's degree in international relations and African security studies from Yale University. Alexis, over to you, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and thanks to the Wilson Center for holding this discussion. Just to put something out of the way up front, CRS, my employer, to be clear, does not take a position or make recommendations on policy or legislative options presented to Congress. But with that, I will move into some points on MONUSCO, which I've been asked to address. So first, I was asked to start with a discussion of MONUSCO, including challenges that the mission has faced. Now, MONUSCO's predecessor mission, MONUC, was a product at its inception of UN Security Council concern at DRC's regional war in the late 1990s. Over the years, MONUC and then MONUSCO now has evolved into a complex mission with a mandate emphasizing the protection of civilians, the extension of state authority in Eastern DRC, along with a wide range of other tasks, as meanwhile, the country's conflict has evolved into an entrenched humanitarian emergency involving abusive state security forces and numerous locally rooted and fractious armed groups. Key challenges overall relate to, first, the genuine difficulty of advancing peace in Eastern DRC, where tensions over access to land and citizenship rights, along with access to political patronage, criminal activity, and regional geopolitics have all helped drive a very complicated conflict and situation on the ground. Second, a lack of capacity and/or political will on the part of key troop contributing countries to fulfill the more aggressive aspects of MONUSCO's mandate, including protecting civilians from militia attack and forcibly disarming rebel groups in some cases. Third, ensuring accountability for abuses by peacekeeping personnel, which has been a persistent issue that has dogged MONUSCO since its inception. And finally, for the mission's senior leadership, walking a delicate diplomatic line between pressure to denounce abuses by government actors and, on the other hand, a mandate that emphasizes support to state authorities and a practical need to cooperate with the government to carry out many of the mission's regular functions. Relatedly, whether and how to protect civilians from state-led and state-enforced violence has been a key question for the mission and fodder for its critics. Between 2016 and 2018, election delays and political repression caused a surge in urban violence, including in the capital, Kinshasa, that placed new strains on MONUSCO, which at that point had been urged to put the balance of its forces in the east and in rural areas, as did the emergence of new conflicts in previously stable areas of the country, such as the central Kasai region. Forces were stretched thin, and diplomatic tensions between the mission and then President Joseph Kabila spiked. Since the inauguration of former opposition figure Felix Tshisekedi as president in early 2019, MONUSCO has worked more smoothly with the DRC government, but it also faces new questions about its future, already alluded to, and I'll touch on that more in a moment. Regional geopolitical tensions, however, have again been rising in recent years, in particular between Uganda and Rwanda, and between Rwanda and Burundi. Generally, the pattern has been that sub-regional tensions have an impact on dynamics on the ground in eastern DRC. While the reported deployment of Rwandan troops to parts of eastern DRC with apparent approval from President Tshisekedi has heightened local tensions, including along ethnic lines. Full-on proxy warfare in eastern DRC has diminished since the defeat of a previous cycle of Rwandan-backed rebel groups, a Rwandan-backed rebel group known as the M23 in 2013. But proxy war remains a potent threat and source of leverage for regional leaders. Looking ahead, emergent, if nebulous, links between an opaque armed group in eastern DRC known as the ADF and the Islamic State organization may present further challenges to the mission. To pivot from these complicated challenges toward an overview of the US engagement in DRC's peace process and key US policy priorities today, since the early 2000s, US policy has been particularly focused on averting another large-scale war in DRC involving neighboring state forces and proxies. The United States played a high-level role in seeking an end to DRC's 1998 to 2003 regional war, and in responding to Rwandan-backed insurgent movements when they threatened the major city of Goma in the east in 2008 and 2012. Another US policy priority has been support for national elections, and as former President Kabila's second term drew to a close in 2016, an electoral transfer of power to a new president. This pressure, along with domestic pressure and sub-regional pressure, culminated in the 2018 elections and subsequent inauguration of President Tshisekedi. The emphasis by US officials on a political transition seemed driven, at least in part, by a calculation that Kabila's continued hold on power at that point was having a negative effect on peace and stability in DRC, as opposed to the early 2000s when many US officials embraced Kabila as a peacemaker and symbol of generational change in Central Africa. The Trump administration has continued the Obama administration's high-level push for elections to happen and welcomed President Tshisekedi's victory, even as US officials expressed serious concerns about the electoral process itself. The administration has since encouraged Tshisekedi's efforts to build bridges with neighboring countries to the east that have often fomented conflict in DRC, including Rwanda. At the same time, the administration, which has been critical of UN peacekeeping in general, and of MONUSCO in particular, has portrayed the political transition as an opportunity to advance an exit strategy for the mission. In renewing MONUSCO's mandate in December 2019, US diplomats in the UN Security Council secured a reduction in MONUSCO's troop ceiling and a reference to a, quote, successful gradual transition and responsible exit of MONUSCO within as little as 3 years if conditions allow. Questions remain surrounding what viable benchmarks could be defined or met for such an exit. With regard to governance within DRC, US officials have emphasized calls to Tshisekedi to counter corruption and to advance accountability within the security forces. And I would say on both scores, as an analyst, there's a mixed picture there. US targeted sanctions remain in place, both under a country-specific executive order and the Global Magnitsky executive order related to corruption and human rights abuses. And the US has designated far more individuals and, in many cases, state officials than the UN Security Council imposed multilateral sanctions regime. The main targets of both of sanctions designations in the US in recent years have been Kabila regime insiders and financiers, along with the leadership of the ADF armed group. In closing, I would just note that there's long been a debate among Congo analysts about whether the roots of violence in the East and elsewhere are fundamentally local in nature, or whether they're rooted in national level governance approaches by political elites. There's evidence of both dynamics, but each implies a slightly different set of policy responses. And that has been something that has often preoccupied people tasked with generating how best to move forward. With that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Alexis. That was terrific. Our second speaker is Dr. Lisa Genet, a consultant with Mercy Corps. Formerly, Dr. Genet was the fellow for the House Majority Africa Subcommittee on the Hill. She conducted field work in the DRC for projects related to decentralization, and her current work focuses on climate change and conflict in fragile states. She earned her PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University. So the floor is over to you, Dr. Genet. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me here today. It's truly an honor. So I'll jump right in. I'll first start by talking about the current political process domestically for building peace. So President Tshisekedi has made some pretty bold promises after coming to office, and this includes addressing conflict in the eastern provinces. To do this, he has increased diplomacy with neighboring countries, including Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi. He's also mobilized the army and increased its presence in the east, with the goal of demobilizing the various armed groups that are located there. But Tshisekedi is having to contend with three main problems. First, he's dealing with the problem of legitimacy. He came to office through a fraudulent election. He's also dealing with the problem of funding. DRC is, of course, rich in resources, but poor in reality. He also has the problem of results. Since increasing the military presence in the east, attacks on civilians have actually increased. And the military actions there have not really reduced the space controlled by the armed groups, but rather has just redrawn, reconfigured the geography of those groups without really dismantling them. So this brings me to the next point. Why are we lacking these results? I'm going to focus on three main challenges faced by the central government. The first are the dynamics of the army itself. Next are the dynamics within the armed groups themselves. And then the larger, broader challenge of DRC being a failed state. This is, of course, tied to the other two. The armed groups are, in a large part, a response to the failed state. So first, the army is very disorganized and largely ineffective. The army struggles with motivation and with discipline. Soldiers are not paid very well. They don't receive many benefits. And many of the soldiers become passive and complacent. And the armed groups truly benefit from this. The army also struggles to demobilize the armed groups because they lack a reintegration process or strategy. And also more generally, local living conditions have not improved in the area. So in many cases, demobilized members of armed groups will actually return to the armed groups after being frustrated and disappointed. So this is indicative of the failed state, which I'll talk about now. And the failed state and the dynamics of the armed groups themselves are very interrelated. So first, by failed state, I mean that the national government is not serving the basic needs of the population. It's not performing the basic functions of state. And importantly, it does not have a monopoly on violence. And in many respects, this void created by the state has been filled by the armed groups. The armed groups act as a de facto government in many of the eastern territories, and security has really been outsourced to them. In some cases, there's actually some successful cases of this. So sometimes you'll actually see improved welfare for citizens and sometimes even stability. This, of course, comes at a large price. The armed groups bring violent abuses, they fan intercommunal conflict, and they undermine legitimacy of the state. And the armed groups operate outside official channels, so there's no transparency, they're not bound by official rules and laws. And this means that the sovereignty of the state, of Congolese government, is really in question. What you see instead are partial horizontal sovereignties. So it's not obvious who is in control. And then the dynamics of the armed groups themselves are also very important. In particular, their extractive enterprises. The behavior of the armed groups, they're more complex than the outright violence and theft, which we do see. They are violent and they do engage in theft. But paradoxically, they also mimic many functions of the state, which is largely absent. Raul Sanchez de la Sierra refers to them as stationary bandits when they settle in areas and set up illegal tax and administration systems in exchange for protection. These armed groups control the population's access to mining revenues, and they fill essential functions left by the state in order to better expropriate. For example, they'll set up roadblock taxes, they'll sell illicit mining visas, things like that. And the armed groups really play on the population's fears, and they exploit the need, perceived or otherwise, for more security. They also recruit along ethnic lines, which reinforces intercommunal tensions. And this could all be made more complicated by COVID. With the decreased trade activity due to lockdowns and just people staying home, the armed groups are losing revenue from roadblock taxes. And so they may increase violent activities in order to increase extraction. They may play up on fears of demands for more security and just fears from the pandemic. And they could have tried and appropriate aid targeted to COVID. So this will bring me to my 3 policy recommendations. I'm going to offer 2 internal domestic recommendations and 1 larger recommendation for external policymakers. So the first is simple. The first domestic recommendation is for Tshisekedi to continue diplomacy with neighboring countries. This will be crucial for long-lasting peace. The second domestic recommendation is bigger and it's much more complex, which is to confront the failed nature of the state. So this can mean it will require actually dramatic reforms of national and local institutions. Specifically, it can mean setting up legitimate and representative governments, especially at the local level, that include the marginalized ethnicities. And actually holding local elections, which has not been done, this could be a good place to start. It also means, of course, improving basic service delivery, but that requires funding that is just not there. Decoupage and decentralization have not necessarily reduced conflict. What we need is an actual legitimate transfer of power to local governments rather than just on paper. And we also need to free up local leaders who are being held financially hostage by the central government. It also means largely addressing the very extensive and entrenched patronage networks that exist all across Congo. Clientelism has really become institutionalized, and this contributes to ethnic exclusion and marginalization. It also siphons off and drains resources. And for promoting peace, this can mean starting by rooting out the entrenched patronage networks within the security forces. And so I'll jump now to the recommendation for external policymakers. My first recommendation here is just to recognize the complexity of the conflict. There are over 100 armed groups in the Kivu provinces alone. And along with that is to seek a deep contextual knowledge of the conflicts, of the locations before proposing any solutions.
1 minute, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to give an example of a failed policy, which is part of the Dodd-Frank Act. It was the policy of requiring companies to report supply chains that are linked to conflict minerals. I say it's failed because it sounds good on paper, but it actually perversely increased conflicts. And by one study, it roughly doubled conflicts. And according to one theory, this is because it reduced the incomes of artisanal miners, and that in turn reduced opportunity costs of joining armed groups. With more armed groups, more members, you have more conflict. So this just points to the necessity of thinking about unintended consequences and really understanding the context. So one tangible policy recommendation I'll give here is to empower and support local governments with financial support or other resources, because the local governments are the ones who truly do understand the context. And I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Appreciate those remarks very much. We'll move now to our third speaker, Father Rigobert Menani. Father Rigobert has served for more than 10 years as the head of the Research, Peace, Human Rights, Democracy, and Good Governance Department at the Center for Research and Social Action, also known as CPAS, in the DRC. And he's also a board member of Congo Afrique, which is the CPAS journal in which Rigobert has published many articles on peace building in the DRC. Father Rigobert is a human rights and peace activist and a co-founder in Bukavu, DRC, of Group Jeremy, which is a human rights group. And he's also the founder in Kinshasa of a network of 80 faith-based human rights and civic education organizations throughout the DRC. Father Rigobert holds an advanced degree in political science from the University of Palermo, a master's in theology from the University of Montreal, a BA in theology and human sciences from the Catholic University of Kinshasa, and a BA in philosophy from St. Pierre Canisius, also in Kinshasa. Father Rigobert has completed his PhD in political science at the Catholic Institute of Paris. He's also a public speaker and a writer, and in 2009 he published the book called From the Nairobi Pact of Stability to the Goma Agreement, Peacebuilding Challenges in the Congo. Father Rigobert is currently a scholar here at the Wilson Center with us through the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding. So for the last several months, it's been a delight for us to have you as a colleague with the Africa program at the Wilson Center through the SVNP program. So Father Rigobert, the floor is yours for comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So I've been asked to respond to the questions, the roles of the UN peacekeeping in the DRC. Through a number of my readings, I've realized that their missions have been changing over the time. In fact, the UN at the beginning, as the other speakers have said, it was meant to address the question of ceasefire, to monitor the ceasefire, even to help the withdrawal of the Rwandan troops and the Ugandan troops from the DRC. And then from that time, what happened is that after almost every main crisis, its mandate was changed, his size was increased, his power was broadened, and at the end, they had to change the name. It was MONUSCO and it became MONUSCO, including many other things, including questions like helping the Congo to build a new army, to help in DDR operations, to support elections, to work in reconstructions, even to use force to protect civilians. So it was a very long list of things that the UN was supposed to do in the Congo. So, so if we take all this element of its own mandate, we can draw a number of elements we can consider like a toolkit that we've been using. And considering to readings, they're not very different from what the UN does in other countries. So they had in the first position the question of ceasefire, and then they had the peace talk. So they helped the Congo to help to organize the Congolese dialogue in South Africa. And then they insisted of having government of unity. Those who knows a bit the history of Congo, we had something very special. After the war, we had a president with 4 vice presidents, and they have everyone among the vice presidents were coming from a rebel group and keeping the control of one part of the power in the Congo that was not very easy to manage. And then in 2006, we managed finally to have the first elections that we can say during that time, the MONUSCO played a very important role. It was the first time that the Congo went through in elections, and it was almost successful. And then after that, they started being involved in security service reforms that never finished. So I can continue, but I think these are a main element of what I can call the toolkit of the MONUSCO and DRC. So if MONUSCO has been effective in the DRC, there is a number of reports that have been coming now since MONUSCO is addressing the question of its exit plan. And one of that report, I think I will advise it, is the EPON report that was published by that big agency from Norway. We can see that the only one thing that has been pointed out as a true success from the MONUSCO for the 20 years, it has been the way they've managed the monitoring of the ceasefire between Rwanda and Uganda and the Congolese government in 99, from 1999 to 2000, and especially to manage the withdrawal of the Rwandan troop from the DRC and the Ugandan troop from DRC. This was something. I can add in my side the fact that they help a lot for the negotiation, for the dialogue. I can add also the work that was done by the CIAT, that was International Committee of Accompaniment of the Transition, that played a very important role to succeed, to help the government of Congo to succeed the transition period. And then I can add also the question of elections. So this is what you can say that was more, you can consider like success. So limitation here, it is a very long list. I will not give all the elements that are coming from different reports. But what we can say in brief is that, in fact, the UN never had a people-centered approach in Congo. The number of concerns of local community never been included truly in their own frame. I'm referring to the 15 recommendations that came from the Goma agreement. And they gave a number of things that were supposed to be considered to build peace in Congo. This never been truly considered. So the situation is what all the speakers have said. So the violence in the Kivu and the Mituri never stopped. The humanitarian crisis never got down. The human rights abuses, even gender violence has been at the top for the Congo. And the regional aspect of ongoing conflicts never truly draw their full attention. When you see the reports, the EPON reports, they're coming back onto this fact that, in fact, even if the interventions of countries, neighbor countries, in the conflict in Congo has made their task very difficult, they never truly pay attention to address the issue, the role of the neighbors countries. And this for me is very crucial, it's very important. Because this point has been in Congo a kind of taboo. In my research in the Wilson Center, I developed a number of peace agreements that was signed, and you will not see question of human rights there, not see the question of trying to address the responsibility of those who are sponsoring armed groups. And then we have today something very bad, the number of armed groups that are created every day and that die and create again. So more than 100, according to the studies. So, what may be then the three policy recommendations that I can draw from here. First, for me, there is a big responsibility of the DRC government. It's important for the DRC government to consolidate its democratic governance. And even if we had three set of elections, 3 cycles of elections, the last elections didn't help the Congo, and the country that have supported that didn't help truly the Congo, because now we are truly in the middle of a big crisis of legitimacy, and we don't know what will be the way forward. So the question of consolidating democracy and having at least electoral system reform and having the reform of the army, it will be very crucial for the beginning. And then to end, I think for the UN, the recommendation will be to deeply address the true reasons behind the many direct and the indirect involvement of the Rwanda and Uganda in the Congo. This question that has been a taboo, this question that has been documented by many researchers, including the expert of the UN, and this question that has been addressed through different hearings here in the subcommission, but no one has taken the courage to address the issue. So I will stop there, Mike, and leave to the other one.
Thank you, Father Rigobert. That was an excellent synopsis of the various tools in the peace building toolkit in the DRC, where there have been successes, where the failures have been, and what some of the recommended ways forward are. Our wrap-up speaker is Ms. Aditi Gorur. Ms. Gorur is a senior fellow and director of the Protecting Civilians in Conflict program at the Stimson Center. Her primary research focus is on preventing and responding to violence against civilians, particularly in the context of peacekeeping operations. She holds a master's degree in international security from Georgetown University, and both a Bachelor of Arts in Development Studies and a Bachelor of Laws with honors from the University of Melbourne. So Aditi, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Mike, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here and to see so much ongoing interest in the DRC with such a great audience online. Those of us kind of calling in from DC today are also reminded really painfully of the importance of peace building and efforts to push for responsive and accountable institutions and the consequences of failure for those efforts. So I'm really grateful to be part of such an important discussion. As Mike mentioned, my expertise is in peacekeeping. So I've been asked to focus my remarks on MONUSCO and how peacekeeping missions efforts are linked to peace building. Father Rigobert has already talked about a lot of changes that MONUSCO has gone through over time. And so I wanted to start just by providing a kind of historical context for some of those changes. As many of you might know, peacekeeping went through a big reform effort at the beginning of the 21st century. So in 2000, there was the first real effort to review UN peacekeeping, and the review culminated in what became known as the Brahimi Report. And that report said that the gains of peacekeeping were being lost because of relapses in violence. And it made some recommendations about ways that peacekeeping missions could be enhanced to try and prevent those gains from being lost. So in the wake of the Brahimi Report, we saw the introduction of what they call multidimensional peacekeeping. And that effort, multidimensional peacekeeping, was to try and better link peacekeeping with peace building. And that involved, in the years following the Brahimi Report, a lot of efforts to add new kinds of personnel and capacities and mandates to ensure that UN peacekeeping missions weren't only mitigating the immediate triggers of violence, but also laying the groundwork for governance reforms and institution building to address the grievances that lay at the roots of conflict. So you can kind of see that as the beginning of a real effort to try and link peacekeeping to peace building. We also saw in that time period the beginning of integration of peacekeeping missions. That means linking UN peacekeeping missions together with the UN development and humanitarian agencies. So these were all part of this broader agenda to make multidimensional peacekeeping more effective and to link peacekeeping with peace building. That was all happening, all of these changes I'm describing, that was all happening, as I said, at the beginning of the 21st century. So as Father Rigobert mentioned, that was around the time that MONUC first deployed as well. So MONUC and the UN presence in DRC has really seen, has lived through a lot of these changes. So let's fast forward from the early 2000s to today. And now we're at a point where there are these major conflicting forces within the UN when it comes to that question of how peacekeeping links to peace building. On one hand, we have a UN Secretary General who puts a really heavy emphasis on peace building and conflict prevention. He's been a huge advocate and champion for the sustaining peace agenda, and who many would actually describe as a bit of a skeptic when it comes to peacekeeping, who prefers to keep the emphasis on the peace building and conflict prevention side. So that you have all of that on one hand. On the other hand, you have kind of these forces that are pushing away from linking peacekeeping to peace building. You have strong budgetary pressure on peacekeeping. especially but not exclusively from the US government under the Trump administration. But you also have this concern from a lot of stakeholders that peacekeeping missions are being asked to do too many things all at once, and that's diluting their impact. So in the last few years, we've seen UN peacekeeping reform initiatives call for prioritization and sequencing of peacekeeping missions. And that's an effort to try and stop essentially mission creep, stop peacekeeping missions from spreading their efforts too thinly over too many different things and focus their efforts on a more limited number of tasks. So that combination of the budgetary pressure and the call for prioritization and sequencing of peacekeeping, that's really called into question a lot of the tasks that peacekeeping missions do that are linked to the peacekeeping, the peace building space. A lot of those tasks that had been introduced after the Brahimi report in the early 2000s, that's the types of things that peacekeeping missions have been tasked with supporting, like security sector reform, DDR, support for the justice system and correction system, capacity building for state actors. Those are the kinds of tasks that are now being called into question, whether it's even appropriate for peacekeeping missions to be doing these kinds of things. I think peacekeeping missions broadly, and MONUSCO included, have been criticized, that these types of tasks are called into question for two reasons. One is just the track record. Are peacekeeping missions actually good at doing these kinds of tasks well? I think there's been a mixed track record. Father Rigobert did mention some really important successes. I could add some to that. For example, MONUSCO's extraordinary success in combating child recruitment within the FARDC, I think, is an important one. But as I say, it is a mixed record in terms of whether peacekeeping missions do these types of peace building tasks well. And the second kind of criticism is that, as I say, that they having peacekeeping missions being involved in so many different things might distract missions from the tasks where they have comparative advantages. So it might kind of dilute the mission's efforts. So I think all of that is just a bit of context for understanding where we are today, why, where the UN sees the linkages between peacekeeping and peace building, and why they might be a little bit under threat at this moment. I wanted to mention just a few challenges that MONUSCO and peacekeeping missions more generally have had when they try and link peacekeeping to peace building. As Father Rigobert mentioned, MONUC and MONUSCO have been there for a couple of decades now and have pretty limited successes to show when it comes to peace building. So what are some of those challenges that have prevented that peace building work from taking root? I think one of the main ones that MONUSCO has faced has been the challenge of host state consent. As you all know, peacekeeping missions must have the consent of the host state in order to operate. And Alexis mentioned already how difficult it can be to navigate, for MONUSCO's leadership to navigate that challenge. On the one hand, they're trying to push for protection of civilians from state forces. On the other hand, they know they need to maintain the host state's consent to stay and remain operational in the country. The Kabila administration regularly threatened, explicitly or implicitly, to revoke its consent from MONUSCO and then try to control what MONUSCO did. So the issue of host state consent has been a huge limitation in MONUSCO's progress. Another challenge has been the division of labor and MONUSCO's ability to cooperate with UN agencies. A lot of these peace building linked tasks that I've mentioned, like support for justice and support for security sector reform, those are tasks that peacekeeping missions do that overlap with the mandates of UN agencies like UNDP. And that often creates turf battles between peacekeeping missions and UN agencies, and that leads to a lot of duplication of efforts and wasted resources. A third challenge that Father Rigobert mentioned, so I won't go into too much detail, is the difficulty that peacekeeping missions face in engaging in a meaningful way with local communities and managing local conflict. Peacekeeping missions have historically tended not to treat local conflict as a priority, since they're generally deployed to support national level political processes. And they've also not been very good historically at engaging in a meaningful way, in meaningful dialogue with local communities. I think that MONUSCO has pioneered many innovative ways to change those trends, and it's made some huge improvements over the course of its deployment, but missions like MONUSCO do still struggle to really talk to ordinary people in local communities compared to NGOs and local civil society organizations. And the last challenge I wanted to mention is budgetary pressure. Mike mentioned up top that MONUSCO has a $1 billion annual operating budget. It is a big amount of money, but there is huge budgetary pressure on UN peacekeeping and MONUSCO in particular. MONUSCO is under a lot of pressure to exit and to reduce peacekeeping costs. And this is also happening in the context where the US is now $1 billion behind in its payments for UN peacekeeping missions. On top of which, the global pandemic is expected to spark a recession. So there's a huge amount of pressure for MONUSCO to shed some of its tasks, and that pressure translates into limitations on what MONUSCO can actually do on peace building. I wanted to end just with a recommendation, taking all of that into account. I would say that peacekeeping operations do have real strengths and comparative advantages compared to other types of organizations, UN agencies, international and national NGOs, civil society organizations. And we have to really think about what those comparative advantages are when it comes to peace building. In some environments where peacekeeping missions are deployed, some of the more dangerous and volatile environments, some peacekeeping missions have a huge advantage in terms of their presence on the ground. There are countries where peacekeeping missions have much wider presence than agencies or NGOs can, because of the security that they can bring with them. But that's not really true in the DRC, where there's such a vibrant and widespread civil society presence across the country. So I'd say for the most part, MONUSCO's comparative advantages often don't lie in the actual implementation of peace building programs. I think that it would be important for MONUSCO to kind of keep its focus on the areas where it does have comparative advantages. I think those are pushing on sensitive political issues that UN agencies and NGOs and civil society organizations have a harder time pushing on. For example, Father Regover mentioned some of the sensitive politics with neighboring countries, the challenges of pushing for greater legitimacy of the Congolese national government. Dr. Genet also mentioned some of the challenges in pushing for decentralization and empowering local government. Those are really difficult political issues for other types of peace-building organizations to engage on, but MONUSCO, because it comes with this huge amount of political weight, can really make a difference in pushing there. And I think another of its comparative advantages is with the protection of civilians. Despite so many of the failures and really heartbreaking failures over the years, MONUSCO can, it has really important resources, military, police, and civilian resources for protection of civilians, and it needs to continue to make use of those. So I think that trying to use its efforts on those fronts to support and enable peace-building efforts by other groups, as MONUSCO thinks about its own exit from the country, what it can do to pave the way for local organizations and international NGOs and UN agencies that are going to stay on the ground, who can continue those longer-term peace-building efforts, making sure that they have the political space and leverage to implement their work. I think that's going to be the most important task for MONUSCO going forward.
Great, thank you, Aditi. And thank you to all four of our speakers for doing an excellent job to frame the issue for our following discussion. So we'll move now into the Q&A session. We have a good 45 minutes remaining for that. Before I turn to some of the questions, I just want to remind our online audience that they can tweet us any questions to @AfricaUpClose using hashtag #PeaceInDRC, or emailing questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org, or using the chat function on our Zoom platform. But what I'll do is I'll kick the session off. I'll pose the first one or two questions and ask each of the four speakers to answer in turn. We'll go in the same order where we did the opening remarks. So we'll start with you, Alexis, and I would ask each of you to limit your response to about 2.5 minutes. So the first question is, I really want to focus on the international angle of the DRC conflict. Very clearly the DRC conflict has been a regional issue. And like we've seen with so many civil conflicts, not just around the continent, but around the world, is that in some cases, neighboring countries actually benefit from the ongoing instability. So in the case of DRC, you know, how do we engage on the peace process with key regional partners? In the case of DRC, it includes Rwanda, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Burundi, other countries as well. So what are some of the concrete measures that African and international policymakers can put in place to incentivize regional actors to push for peace, you know, in a context where perhaps some of these neighboring countries may stand to benefit from ongoing instability in the DRC? So Alexis, let me kick it over to you for the first response.
Yeah, thanks for that question. In a way, this goes to the heart of diplomatic challenges for the United States and other external actors in trying to shape outcomes in DRC, because of course the US also has other priorities and other existing diplomatic relational considerations with regard to each of DRC's neighbors. I would say I'm sure others will have well-formed thoughts on this. From where I sit, one tool that has been that has had some impact over the years has been sort of diplomatic naming and shaming, and then sometimes paired with conditionality on aid or other forms of financial support. So a case study for this was the M23 crisis in 2012, which involved the sort of latest iteration of a cyclical rebellion in North Kivu province in eastern DRC, backed by Rwanda, according to US officials and UN sanctions monitors. And at that time, senior US officials spoke out very publicly to indicate their assessment that Rwanda was providing crucial support to the M23. And then the Obama administration at the time and Congress went further in both restricting some military assistance to Rwanda. Actually, Congress initiated that action through appropriations legislation by placing conditions on certain types of US military aid to Rwanda if it were found to be supporting rebel groups in eastern DRC. And then the executive branch sort of invoked those provisions in a public way. And then that also led other donors in Europe in particular to curtail some non-military aid or redirect some non-military aid that they had been providing to Rwanda. And it's hard to prove a one-to-one cause and effect, but there was a reported sort of withdrawal of some of that support on the part of Rwanda, and ultimately the M23 was militarily defeated. So it's a case study. It's hard to draw sweeping conclusions from that, but it does indicate that at times sort of public, for a country that depends on its relations with external donors for financial support and military legitimacy and military training, even though Rwanda reacted very negatively to those allegations and never acknowledged, in fact, always denied that there was any truth to them, we still did arguably see a change in behavior. Now, would that work with other countries in the region? You know, Burundi, for example, much more diplomatically isolated, has proven its ability to, the government at least has proven a very high tolerance for international sanctions and criticism. Probably there's a different set of considerations there. If you look at Uganda, you know, there's a different US relationship with Uganda, a different donor relationship with Uganda. So again, hard to draw wide conclusions, but it's intriguing to think about.
Thanks, Alexis. Lisa, can we go over to you for your thoughts on the international angle to this conflict?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to continue engaging with the neighboring countries, which, as you said, is difficult. There's sometimes going to be conflicting interests. How do you incentivize cooperation? I think a lot of it just has to be political will and leadership, which may not come from the international community. It may have to come from citizens and civil societies, and a way to support them could come from the international community to support citizens and civil societies. But I think continuing to have bilateral meetings and you know, engaging with the African Union, having meetings and summits, I think that's all very positive. And this is no secret, but when you have peace, you have increased trade and revenue and positive spillovers in technology and education. And, you know, everyone sort of knows that, the leaders know that too, but it could be something that could be emphasized by the international community. And I'll hand it over.
Great, thanks. Father Rigobert, let's go to you. I know you've looked at this question quite a bit of international engagement, regional engagement in the DRC. They have a history of being involved in the conflict. Neighboring countries also have a history of being involved in the peacebuilding efforts. What are the best ways to engage the region so that they play a role that is on balance, you know, far more positive than negative?
Yeah, I agree with the position of Alexis and Lisa. I think there is two things that need to be looked at. First, it's the involvement of the country themselves. The last report on the evaluation of the MONUSCO that I've referred to, the IPON one, have said that MONUSCO normally, when it is left up alone with not the support of the members of the Security Council, they cannot do anything. And it goes further, saying that there is no willing of many of these countries to solve the instability of the Congolese crisis. So this is something very strong. That meaning that there is a kind of laissez-faire from a number of powers. I followed very closely the situation of M23, and I could see the involvement of the US government. They had a special representative on the ground who was moving from one part to another one, and who makes sure that when they are addressing the crisis, he will go and sit in some of the countries to pressure these people. And then we saw the result. So that meaning that there is possibility of addressing this question if there is a will of doing something. Secondly, as a researcher, I was working very closely to understand what was going wrong, because when countries are involved, not one time, but 10 times invading the other countries, it means that behind their action, there is something more profound that have to be investigated on. Someone have to resolve, to address that question. And people kept asking themselves, what are the root causes of the conflict in Congo? And no one want to go and see where it started. What are the motivation? Why a country like Rwanda tried the first time with AFDL, then the LCD, then the SAD KLM, then the Nkunda group, then the M23. And you don't go to ask you people what is there. So we have reports on that too. We have the team of experts of the UN who came with a number of funding after interviewing some of the top officials in these countries. And no one wanted to address that issue. So for me, the question, it is a question of the engagement of countries, those who can talk to the regions. But beyond the engagement, it is to address truly what is the concern of Rwanda and Uganda that has pushed them to come to Congo all the time. We've seen all the researchers they know now. We've seen 96. They were talking about the question of Banyamulenge people. Today, no one is coming to this question today. And then we saw people advancing the question of looting the natural resources. We came with Dodd-Frank, and then it was dropped. So we have the impression that there is no one who wants to master the problem. We have no one who wants to study the problem. We have no one who wants to address the root causes of the problem. And for me, this is one of the lacking. So it's a matter of the leadership. It's a matter of trying to involve international community, and especially the member of Security Council to address this problem.
Thank you, Father Rigobert. Aditi, let's go over to you for the international angle commentary on that, please.
Thanks, Mike. I think the other speakers have already kind of covered the important points. I would just say Alexis and Father Rigobert both mentioned the example of M23. I think that was a really clear illustration of the kind of 1-2 punch that support from the diplomatic community, united support from the Security Council, combined with a peacekeeping presence on the ground. The way that those two things working in combination can really make a difference. So as we think about, Alexis mentioned already some of the ways that those two pieces work together, but the peacekeeping missions and the U.S. experts fact-finding on the ground to establish the clear link between M23 and the support coming from Rwanda and Uganda for it, despite those countries' denials, and then the way that the UN mission worked, militarily cooperated with the FARDC to combat the M23 armed group. I think it's a really clear example of the power that a peacekeeping mission can have when it does have that united political support. And the challenges that lie ahead as MONUSCO is under pressure to transition. What does that mean for the international community's ability to exercise that kind of influence in DRC going forward? I think it's going to make things much harder.
Great, thanks, Aditi. We have over 140 online participants, including some people that have really extensive knowledge of the DRC issue, so I'm eager to get to their questions. A number of the questions that have come in are on the international angle. I will get to those questions, but the first question I want to go with is, there's a question from Paul Miller, Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy with Lutheran World Relief. And this question, let's direct it initially to Father Rigobert. Paul Miller asks, given Father Rigobert's description, would you say, Father Rigobert, that despite MONUSCO's successes, MONUSCO nonetheless crowds out local initiatives and has in the past given an excuse to DRC officials and US policymakers not to address the need for local governance and not to address the need for a role of neighboring states in sponsoring armed groups? So two parts to this question, Father Rigobert. One is MONUSCO crowding out local initiative, and then the second question is MONUSCO sort of masking the need to really address the role of neighboring states? So if you can start with the local initiative angle, Father Rigobert.
Yeah, thank you to Paul. I think it's true that MONUSCO from the beginning didn't have a strong approach to civil society. The way Odette have said, we have a very strong civil society in Congo. We have the churches working very strongly on these topics. We have a number of academics who have done a lot of work on trying to understand and addressing the issues. I can say from the position where I sit in Kinshasa in CEPAS, I never see the true engagement of the MONUSCO with academics, local authorities, civil society organizations. They have a kind of political office that have collected a number of NGOs existing, but I think that they have a problem of identifying who is who truly, and they have means of collaborating with organizations locally. But I don't want truly to blame MONUSCO itself, because MONUSCO represents the international community. And MONUSCO is the public face of the international community. And we've seen for these 20 years of their presence, when there were a strong engagement of international community, where there were a kind of consensus at the Security Council, then you'll see MONUSCO they will appoint someone who's a leader who is very strong, who can carry on the work, and then you will get the support with the embassies and the countries, and then they will succeed something. When there is no this kind of consensus, then MONUSCO, it is left alone, and then they become very, very, very weak. So for me, it's a question of how do international community itself address the crisis like that. And then you have all the division between a number of countries addressing the situation in Congo. So you have those who are not interested at all, who are they are maybe in the Security Council, but they are not interested at all. So we have a number of situations where MONUSCO, at the end of the day, they were the one to blame, but then they were under pressure of everybody. It's true that they have their own weaknesses, and I can give a long list of that. But I think these are public affairs of the international community, and they need truly the support of international community to succeed. If that support is not there, if there is no consensus on the way people want to address the crisis, you can put all the people you want on the ground. They will not be able to do anything.
All right, thank you, Father Rigobert. Just want to put this out to our other three speakers. Do any of the three of you want to add any commentary on that question of MONUSCO crowding out other initiatives and issues?
I'll just actually add a bit to that. In my limited experience, I found it to be the case that many local politicians and political actors truly want to do good and want to improve the lives of their citizens. They just either lack funding or are very much stuck in this web of patronage and can't get out of it. And it's not necessarily that they lack political will and they really want to do good. They just kind of can't because of lacking finances and capacity.
Go ahead, Aditi.
So I just wanted to quickly touch on the issue of the local governance support. I think one of the big challenges relates to one of the issues I mentioned earlier, the host state consent issue. For most of MONUSCO's deployment, it was expending a huge amount of its political capital just on negotiating with the Kabila government to be allowed permission to remain in the country. And technically, the principle for peacekeeping missions is that they have to have the support of the major parties to the conflict. But in practice, it is the head of the executive branch that has the sort of legal right to kick the mission out of the country. And so MONUSCO is focusing a huge amount of its efforts on the executive branch, on Kinshasa, and specifically on Joseph Kabila. So I think that if we do see the need for decentralization and support for local governance as a major factor, as a major priority for peace building, then hopefully MONUSCO has a little bit more political space to focus on that issue now.
Terrific, thanks. The next two questions are kind of focused specifically on MONUSCO and its operations and its presence. So I want to go to those two questions, and then I'm going to go to some earlier questions that really look more at the international angle. So the first question is from Olivia Ackland of the Economist Group. And I think I'll direct this question, at least initially, to Alexis. Lots of people in the Beni region say that MONUSCO is too slow to respond to reports of killings. What are the structural problems which mean that MONUSCO is sometimes, or gives the perception that MONUSCO is sometimes slow to react? And who in particular is responsible for giving the green light for MONUSCO to act? So let me first put that question to you, Alexis.
I can take a first stab at that, but I think Aditi would have more insight as well, not to put you on the spot. So yes, this is a persistent, I think I alluded to this at the top, this is a persistent challenge for MONUSCO, is that its mandate emphasizes civilian protection, but there are both, let's say, legitimate and less legitimate reasons why that's very difficult to do in practice. So I mentioned one key problem at the top, which is troop contributor will and capacity. That has been a major challenge, not just in Beni, but in other parts of Eastern Congo. Some troop contributors have written caveats, from their capitals about when and where they can use force or deploy in response to alarm. then in practice, there are additional constraints, individual commanders, maybe at the battalion or even unit level, who are just reluctant to put their forces in harm's way. In the Beni region specifically, I think there are additional challenges that relate to the nature of insecurity in Beni. I mentioned the ADF, which is one among several armed groups operating in the area, but the ADF is among the more deadly and pernicious, and has been implicated in a string of civilian massacres in and around Beni since 2014. There are particular challenges in identifying who exactly the ADF are, what it means when we say that the ADF are responsible for an attack. There's pretty persuasive research by an independent organization called the Congo Research Group, suggesting for the last few years that many attacks blamed on the ADF in fact implicate members of other militia groups and elements of the state security forces. And in fact, the US and UN Security Council have designated for sanctions a DRC military commander who was commanding troops in the Beni area, General Mundos, who is, my understanding is that he is implicated maybe in serious abuses against civilians, some of which may well have been blamed on the ADF. So I think on top of the kind of structural challenges that MONUSCO faces everywhere in preventing attacks on civilians or responding in a timely fashion to attacks on civilians, there are additional challenges in the Beni area that have to do with the nature of security and these kind of opaque but seemingly credible links between security force actors and militia groups.
Thanks, Alexis. Aditi, do you want to add some commentary on that question?
Sure. I mean, I think Alexis covered it really well. I just, Olivia's question also included this part about who needs to give the green light for MONUSCO to intervene. So I wanted to just respond quickly to that. I would say that in the past, there used to be a lot more confusion over when and how peacekeeping missions could intervene to protect civilians. There was a lot more concern, the peacekeepers felt the need to get authorization before they acted. A lot of that confusion has been cleared up over the years by really important work by the UN Secretariat in New York, changing policy, making sure there are really clear rules of engagement, and strong work from UN Security Council members as well, including the US, to push for really, really strong language in peacekeeping mandates. So for example, the mandate language used to say that peacekeeping missions could protect civilians from imminent threat of physical violence. They dropped the word imminent to make it clear that peacekeeping missions could be proactive. They started putting words like proactive into mandates. So a lot of the previous reasons why peacekeeping missions may have been slow to respond in terms of confusion, concern that they would be criticized for it, and kind of lack of clarity on the front of rules of engagement and things like that. A lot of that confusion has been cleared up now. And we've been talking about decentralization in terms of support for local governance in DRC. There's also been a lot of work over the years to decentralize decision-making in peacekeeping missions. So decentralizing decisions like when and how peacekeeping forces can respond to attacks against civilians, that's been a really important shift in peacekeeping as well, empowering heads of field offices and peacekeeping missions and sector commanders to be able to respond to attacks against civilians instead of having to wait for some authorization to come from capital, has been a really important move. But despite those changes, the ongoing constraints, logistical constraints, and sort of reluctance from troop contributing countries sometimes has also still held peacekeeping missions back. So I think in terms of sort of countering those ongoing challenges, I think the big gap is accountability and oversight for peacekeeping forces, making sure that there's more consistent monitoring and evaluation of what different contingents are doing to respond to attacks against civilians, and holding people publicly accountable when there are failures. I think there was a really important shift on that front a few years ago in South Sudan, when a contingent was held responsible and sort of publicly criticized for failing to respond to an attack against civilians in Malakal, which led to the firing of the force commander in UNMISS at the time. So that kind of ongoing effort for accountability, I think, will be really important.
Thanks, Aditi. We've got a grouping of questions coming in that really look at the international and regional angle, which of course is so critical to the DRC issue. So I'm going to ask those questions. The first of these is from Ambassador Herman Cohen, a name that I'm sure is familiar to very many of you. And let me direct this question first to Lisa and then to Rigobert. Ambassador Cohen's question is, to what extent are the governments of Rwanda and Uganda still sponsoring armed groups in the Eastern DRC, possibly to control artisanal mineral production of gold and coltan? I'm not sure if that's a typo or if I'm, anyway, you get the gist of the question. So Lisa, let's turn that over to you.
Yeah, I don't really feel qualified to answer to what extent Uganda and Rwanda are controlling the access to those minerals, are controlling operations to get access to those minerals. But you do see the price fluctuations very much affect the operations by rebel groups, by armed groups that could or could not be funded by these other governments. So I'm sorry I can't say more about that, but I'll pass it on.
That's fine, thanks. Father Rigobert, can I get your views on that, please?
Yeah, I think Ambassador Cohen should know more because someone who has been involved in that region and been following daily the situation there. I will refer him just to the confidential reports that were sent to the UN Council in 2012 when with the group of experts who said very clearly that because Rwanda was and Uganda was obliged to withdraw from Congo, they've developed other means of being present on the ground and in order to continue their chain of supply on natural resources. So this strategy never changed. So concretely, it may be difficult to document how they are doing it, but it's clear that the number of armed groups growing in Congo every day, you have a number of them that have been controlled or proxies by Rwanda just because they want them to channel the mineral coltan and gold to Rwanda. Let's remind that Uganda and Rwanda have opened a company to refine the gold coming from Congo, and they've been the one selling the coltan of Congo from many years. So I think Ambassador Cohen should know more on that because he's been following this question. But it's something that, for me, we have to put in a broad perspective. If we want to build the peace in the Congo, we better understand what may be the true economical reasons of Rwanda on that, and to start to find how to address it. Is there other reason beyond the economic reasons? The public opinion in the eastern part of Congo, they are convinced that there is another plan. There are other plans behind the intervention of Rwanda in the eastern part of Congo, because they could not be coming over and over just because they were a bit nervous. No, there should be something planned. So no one wants to address that issue. And for me, that's the key element to at least to start addressing instability in the eastern part of Congo.
Thank you, Rigobert. Another question on the international angle focuses more on the big diplomacy aspect of the region. This question comes from Dr. Ni Akuate of George Washington University. And Ni addresses his question to Alexis and Lisa. And this is the question of the regional aspect of the Congo situation is so critical, and included in the regional aspect is you've got some real giants of the region in terms of their leadership, their tenure, their influence. I'm talking about people like President Kagame of Rwanda, President Museveni of Uganda, prominent longtime leaders in their area. How, and for these types of leaders, there are so many different issues that the international community engages with them on, not just the DRC issue, but a whole range of important regional and international issues. So how can the international community really engage with leaders of this stature that have such a critical role in this issue, but also critical roles in many other cross-cutting issues that go beyond just the crisis in the DRC? So can we start with Alexis on this one?
Sure. Thanks. And thanks, Nii. I mean, I feel like I mostly addressed this in my other answer in referring precisely to this issue where the US has to juggle and balance its many diplomatic priorities when it looks at neighboring country involvement in DRC. The US has other diplomatic priorities with each of DRC's neighbors that are more or less important. So with Uganda and Rwanda, for example, Rwanda is a top global contributor of peacekeeping troops to UN missions. That's been a big US priority, is to bolster African contributions to peacekeeping missions, and Rwandan troops are distinguished components of peacekeeping operations throughout the continent. So Rwanda has worked very closely with the US, with US support in bolstering its peacekeeping deployments, in equipping them well, in making them available to very thorny and difficult missions, like in CAR, for example. So that is one priority that the US has to juggle when it also seeks to either punish or deter Rwandan involvement in Eastern DRC. So I think I had touched on that a little bit with talking about the M23 case study. Uganda has its own story, but similarly, the U.S. works with Uganda in a number of regional security issues. Notably, Ugandan troops are the backbone of the UN authorized AU mission in Somalia. That's a top, U.S. regional priority, is to maintain that mission. So of course, it's a balancing act, anytime that the U.S. has concerns.
Thanks, Alexis. Lisa, do you want to add some commentary on that question from Nii?
I mean, I agree with everything Alexis said. I'll just add, I think the AU, the African Union, can have a big role to play here in providing forums for dialogue. And I think generally that's what the international community can do, is just kind of support these meetings and dialogues. But ultimately, it's up to the leaders to cooperate.
Got it. Like to go, we'll have time for at least one more question, and then I want to do a quick round of final wrap-up comments for each of the 4 speakers. This next question, again, kind of delves deeply into the issue of the angle of mineral extraction and how it contributes to the conflict. This question comes from Emily Schaefer, who's the senior DRC desk officer and the Great Lakes Unit Chief at the State Department and the Bureau of African Affairs. It's a long question. I'll summarize it here, but basically Emily's asking about looking at creative solutions for enforcement of the various measures, both US and international, that have been taken to try to get at the problem of how the mineral extraction industry has fueled the conflict. As we heard earlier in the presentation, one of these is the Dodd-Frank Section 1502, which has had some impact on reducing armed group control of the mineral trade and things like tin, tungsten, and tantalum. Also, in the 2010 Lusaka Agreement, there was a certification program for minerals. A lot of this puts the burden on companies and buyers to drive the change. We also heard from Ambassador Cohen's question about artisanal gold. But the crux of the question here is what creative solutions are there for enforcement of these vehicles, and perhaps also other possibly new and related vehicles that can help get at the mineral extraction aspect of fueling of the conflict. So the question was not directed to any specific speaker. So would one of you like to step forward and comment on that question from Ms. Schaefer? Yes, Father Rigobert, please.
Yes, the question of the responsibility of the role of the looting of natural resources in the Congo has been developed and studied by many researchers. So there is a number of things that can be done. One, it is to try to find a kind of to strengthen all the mechanism of chain supply. There is a number of resolution on how you can know if a product has been produced by people involved in violence or in conflicts. In fact, they've put rules, but no one, because there is no commitment in the region, it has been very weak to make sure that the rules are truly are fulfilled. But most of the thing for me to be to help have a kind of common approach on how do the minerals in the eastern part of the Congo profit to the populations. And this has been no one has been addressing it, because what is happening is that Congo government didn't invest in buying itself, so it is not the true buyer. This one side. When people cross the border and go to Uganda and Rwanda, they offer them a good price. So it is impossible to ask people who are digging not to go in that side. And then no one makes sure that those who are from the exploitation to the commercialization, there is a kind of control of who is who there. It is not been done. So I think Dodd-Frank was something that helped during that time, and they helped to decrease the conflict. And now all the mechanisms that have been put in place by the OCDE or the Greek regions has been very weak. So these things have to be revised if you want to address the issue. But I understand, and I shoot at Emily, she's right. We need to tap on that, because this is one of the elements that justified all the growing of all the armed groups.
Thank you, Father Rigobert. There's a number of other questions that I would love to get to, but we're down to our final 4 or 5 minutes. And what I'd like to do is go in turn to each of the 4 speakers, starting with Alexis, and just I'd like to give you each 1 minute to go with a final thought. You know, either a final critical thought that you want to leave our viewers with, or if there's a key point that you didn't get to express earlier, this is your chance to make it. So let's go around the horn, 1 minute each, and start with Alexis.
Thanks. I think this conversation has pointed to a really difficult reality with formulating international approaches to DRC, which is that there's a huge amount of continuity in the pernicious, challenging issues that confront DRC communities at the local level, regional actors, national level actors in DRC, and then international diplomats. And that continuity is striking, even as there are massive political changes in some ways at the top in Kinshasa. Now, of course, there's some political continuity there too. But I think the challenge for MONUSCO and then for other peacebuilding initiatives and peacekeeping initiatives is grappling with what has and hasn't changed, what opportunities are real and which ones are more illusory, and what sort of the I won't even call it the post-Kabila era, but I'll call it, the post-2018 era means for what opportunities can and can't be seized and what problems have and haven't really faded.
Thank you, Alexis. Lisa, let's go over to you for final wrap-up comment.
Yeah, I'll keep this short. I think I said mostly everything I wanted to say. I just want to, emphasize the complexity of the conflict situation and emphasize the need to understand the context.
Got it. Okay. Father Rigobert, your final thought in 1 minute.
Yeah, for me, one of the things I want to say is that in all this process, leadership matters. People they put in position of representative of the Secretary General in Kinshasa, it matters. People who they put as who are coming as a special envoys, it matters. Engagement of leadership in different capitals of the Security Council countries matters. So and then the leadership and the quality of the leadership in Kinshasa matters.
Excellent. Thank you, Father. And lastly, a last word to Aditi.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to touch quickly on the issue of, I think we all need to think about whether peacekeeping missions can and should be playing a greater role when it comes to the role of natural resources and fueling conflict. There are plenty of people I've talked to in MONUSCO who feel really frustrated that they couldn't do more. And some people I've talked to who said, you know, if MONUSCO had just focused its troop around mining areas all of these decades, it would have made much more of an impact on the conflict there. But as I said, very little interest from the international community in expanding peacekeeping missions mandates.
Got it. Thanks, Aditi. We need to wrap up. I just want to say, sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but for those of you who sent in questions that we couldn't get to, we will send these questions to the speakers and they will email responses to you. So for those of you who sent in questions we didn't get to, please provide your email addresses so that we can get the written responses back to you. I just want to thank our speakers for an enlightening conversation. Thanks also to the audience for following the conversation and sending us your questions. And finally, thank you to the Africa program staff and the entire Wilson Center team, including our amazing AV team. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.